Hey friends, how you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ein Ches, Daf Ach. Yevamos. Friends, I got some good news and I got some schlechte news. The good news is that, well, I only prepared half the daf, so I guess you're gonna get off early today. The schlechte news is, well, tomorrow's my stomach gonna be longer. Yeah. Let me tell you, today was a bit of a roller coaster, l'maisa, and it is what it is, l'maisa. Friends, today we're talking about Mitzris, Edomites, right? Which we said that for 3 generations they're not allowed to marry into the congregation. That after that they are permitted. So we had seen that that Reb Shimon's opinion is that just like by Ammonis and Moavis, it only applies to the men, not to the women. The women can marry into the congregation immediately. So says Reb Shimon, the same applies to Mitzris and Edomis as well. So now says the Gemara, on Daf Ein Zayin and Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Toner Rabbanan, the rabbis taught bonim below bonis. The Reb Shimon. The Reb Shimon says, bonim asher yivoldu loim dor shlishi yavaloim b'kal Hashem. It says bonim, boys, not girls. The girls could marry into the congregation immediately. Omer Reb Yehuda, says Reb Yehuda, Hareyu Omer. But 1 second, the pasuk says bonim asher yivoldu loim dor shlishi hakosuf tloim beleido. That it says that the children that will be born, 3rd generation. So it's being born. Boys are born, but so are girls. So therefore, Reb Yehuda says that it applies to both men and women. They have to wait 3 generations before they can marry into the congregation. You hear that? Let's read that again. Reb Yochanan says, if not for the fact that Reb Yehuda said that because of it says that it applies both to men and to women, that they have to wait 3 generations, he wouldn't be able to lift his hand or feet in the base of Medrash. He would be stuck. Because since Reb Yehuda's opinion is that the congregation of converts is considered the congregation, and therefore, if a Mitzri is not allowed to marry into the congregation for 3 generations, the congregation includes converts. And therefore, Mitzri Sheni b'mayitar. If you were to say, like Reb Shimon, that the Mitzri and Edomi women can marry into the congregation immediately, well then, that would mean that they're just considered like regular converts, regular gerim. And Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that that converts are considered part of the congregation, and therefore Mitzris and Edomis would be unable to marry converts because they're considered part of the congregation. So now says Rabbi Yochanan that if Rabbi Yehuda would have said like Reb Shimon that the women are able to marry into the congregation immediately, well then he'll find himself in trouble because that would make them just regular converts, and converts are considered part of the kahal, which would mean that the male Egyptians would basically be stuck, right? The Mitzrim and the Mitzris and the Edomis who convert to Judaism, they're basically stuck. Who are they able to marry? They can't marry Edomi or Mitzri women because the women are just able to marry into the congregation immediately. They're just like regular Gerim, and Edomis and Mitzris are not allowed to marry Gerim. So therefore, says Rabbi Yochanan, that it's a good thing that Rabbi Yehuda says that the prohibition against marrying into the congregation applies both to men and women, Mitzris and Edomis, which means that the women also are unable to marry into the congregation for 3 generations. So the male and the female Edomis and Mitzris can marry each other. Okay. But Dilma, the Over V'Nosib, for 1 second, maybe, no. maybe the Edomi and Mitzri women are immediately able to marry into the congregation. So then how is it possible to have the Edomi and the Mitzri men, getting married and having a second generation and then a third generation who's then allowed to marry into the congregation? How are they going to have a second generation and a third generation if they're not allowed to marry anybody? Because even the Mitzri and Edomi women would be forbidden to them since, they're considered part of the congregation. But maybe you could say that the Over V'Nosiv, maybe what the Pasuk is saying, no. That really, theoretically, even if you would say that the Egyptian and Edomite women could immediately marry into the congregation, so then how can you have a situation of these Mitzri and Edomi men having a second and third generation? Maybe if they married a Bas Yisrael, right? Married somebody who they weren't allowed to marry. The Over V'Nosiv, what the Pasuk is saying is that even if he married somebody who wasn't allowed to marry, then still, then comes the third generation, they would be able to then marry into the congregation. To which the Gemara says, yeah, but the Torah isn't talking about situations that aren't allowed, right? The Torah is not going to say, if you have an Edomi or a Mitzri, there's nobody who's allowed to marry. You can't even marry the Edomite and the Mitzri women who converted because they're just regular converts. But if he violated and did it anyway, so then the Torah is saying the third generation could then marry into the congregation. The Pasuk isn't talking about people who did the wrong thing. Right? To which the Gemara says, yeah, but what about a mamzer? A mamzer is a b'diavad situation. A mamzer is not a situation that you're allowed to get yourself into. And yet, the Pasuk talks about it. To which the Gemara says, yeah, the Torah could talk about b'diavad situations such as like a mamzer that's not allowed. It talks about a mamzer to teach that a mamzer is also, to teach that the halacha that you're not allowed to marry a mamzer. The Torah has to teach that. But the Torah isn't going to teach things that are permitted. The Torah is not going to say, look, an Edomite or a Mitzri is unable to marry anybody, but if they did, so then the third generation is already allowed to marry into the congregation. The Torah is not going to say things that are permitted in forbidden situations or from forbidden situations. To which the Gemara says, yeah, but what about Machzir Grushaso? Who remembers what a Machzir Grushaso is? Machzir Grushaso is if you have a married couple, right? Reuven and Sarah, they're married, they get divorced. Sarah then marries Shimon, and either Shimon dies, or they get divorced, and then she goes back and marries Reuven again, even though she's not allowed to. So, in that situation, we say that she is a toeva, but her children are not. So there, we see there as well that the Torah is saying that. So you have a situation of a situation that's not allowed, right? Reuven isn't allowed to remarry Sarah after she was married to Shimon. But nonetheless, the Torah is saying that even in that b'diavad situation, the children are permitted. So also mishum ikar isuru d'chasve. But over there by Machzir Grushaso, really the main point of what's written over there is to say that she is a toeva. That's the main thing. And then we infer from that the children are not toevas, but that's not the point over there was not to say that in a case of Machzir Grushaso, the children are permitted. That's not the point. The point is that Machzir Grushaso is not permitted. And then we learn from Midrash that, but it only applies to her, not the kids. As opposed to the Egyptians, right? The whole point is that we're teaching that that the third generation is then allowed to marry into the congregation, Mazel Tov. But that's not going to be in a situation that's b'diavad, like where, but that only comes about if you have a Mitzri or an Edomite who marries somebody who's not allowed to marry. No, that's not the case. And therefore, Mimele, the Torah is talking about a lechatchila situation, and therefore, it would make sense according to Reb Yehuda, who says that Kol Gerim Ikrei Kohol, that converts are considered part of the congregation. So then, Mimele, it must be that the men and the women, Edomite and Egyptians, are not allowed to marry into the congregation for 3 generations, and therefore they can at least marry each other, and then comes the 3rd generation, and the child is then permitted to marry into the congregation, and that's all lechatchila. Tanu Rabbanan de Rabbi Stad, Im Nemar Bonim Lo Nemar Doris, by the pasuk of Mitzri ve'Edomi, how come it says banim, children, as well as doros, generations. Why do we need both to refer to children as well as to generations? So, right, im nemar banim lo menemar doros, vim nemar doros lo menemar banim. If it says banim, why does it say doros? If it says doros, why does it say banim? Im nemar banim v'lo nemar doros, because if it would say banim, children, but it didn't mention the generations, hayis omer ben rishon v'sheni asur shlishi muter. I would have thought, well, okay, it doesn't have to be different generations. It could even be, if you have a Mitzri or an Edomi who converts to Judaism, and then I might think, okay, so if they have 3 kids, the first and the second are not allowed to marry into the congregation, but the third child can. Therefore it mentions generations. No, it's not talking about 3 children from the same generation. It's talking about 3 separate generations. If it would only mention generations, but it wouldn't mention children, I would say, I might think, what does it mean 3 generations? Well, the people that were standing at Mount Sinai and heard this halacha, so then it only applies to those 3 generations. Them, their children, and their grandchildren. Well, their grandchildren already would be permitted to marry into the congregation. Therefore it says children, i.e., even for all generations, if you have a Mitzri or an Edomi that marries into the congregation, so then they have to wait 3 generations. Lohem, when the pasuk says Lohem mehem maneh, it means count from them, right? So if you have an Egyptian who converts to Judaism, so he's considered generation number 1, and then his child is generation number 2, and then their child is generation number 3, who is permitted to marry into the congregation. Lohem, when it says in that pasuk Lohem a second time, right? It says, but Lohem to Shlishi of Lohem Bikal Hashem. So it says Lohem in the pasuk twice. So the first one is saying that you count from them, that they are considered generation 1. And the second one is Halech Achar Psulan, that you go based on their Pisulan, their Psul, what's a Psul? A invalidation or something? Defect. Meaning, if you have a Edomi or a Mitzri who marries a Yisrael, or a Bas Yisrael, so then the child will be an Edomi just like them, or Mitzri just like them, right? You go based on them as opposed to based on the Bas Yisrael. We don't say that, right? So if you have an Edomi who marries a Bas Yisrael, we don't say the child is kosher. No, the child will be just the next generation Edomi or Mitzri. We had to mention Lahem, which means that you count from them, and lemichtav asher yivaldu, it also had to mention that their offspring. Because of achman asher yivaldu, if you would only mention the offspring, havamina mibneim maneh, I may have thought that you start counting the generations from the children. Because of achman loyim, therefore it said loyim to say you start counting from them, from the first generation of converts. V'i kosav achman loyim, and if we only mention to them, I may have thought that, well, what if you have an Egyptian woman who converts to Judaism and she's already pregnant? So I might think that when the baby is born, she and the baby are considered one generation. Therefore the pasuk mentioned Asher Yivaldu, that even the children who are born, right, would be their own generation. So if you have a woman who converts to Judaism from Egypt, right, an Egyptian woman converts to Judaism, so she'll be considered generation 1, and her baby that's born will be considered generation 2, even if she was pregnant at the time that she converted. Fine. We had to mention Lohem by Mitzri, to say that if you have a Mitzri that has a relationship with a Bas Yisrael, so then we go based on him to say that the child will be a Mitzri, as opposed to based on her. And also it says lo by a mamzer, also that if a mamzer has a relationship with a Bas Yisrael, so the child will be a mamzer, not a kosher. So the kosher b'achmana hacha mishum deba mitipa psula. So if we would only mention by the Mitzri, so I might think that we go based on the Mitzri, not based on the Bas Yisrael, because the Mitzri, after all, comes from his parents weren't Jewish. So avo mamzer deba mitipik shera emelo, but a mamzer that he comes from his parents are Jewish, so he comes from a tipik shera. So therefore I might think that in that case, maybe you'd go based on her. If you have a mamzer who sleeps with the Bas Yisrael, so maybe you'd go based on her and the child would be kosher. So therefore I have to say low by mamzer to say that no, we go based on him and the child is considered a mamzer. Because of Achman Agabi mamzer, and if we would only mention by mamzer, mishum dein roi lover b'kol le'olam. Well, a mamzer is particularly strict because a mamzer can never marry into the congregation. So that is why I might say that we go based on him and not based on her, right? And we say that the child is a mamzer. Savalocha imalo. But over here, where already in the third generation, the Mitzri could marry into the congregation. So I might think that we wouldn't necessarily go based on him. We'd go based on her to say that she's ksher. So tzricha, therefore, we need both by Egypt, right, the Mitzris, as well as by the mamzer to say that we go based on the mamzer or the Mitzri, not based on the kosher person who they had a relationship with. What if you have a second generation Mitzri who marries a first generation Mitzris? So do we consider the child to be a second generation or a third generation? So it says that the child will be considered a shlishi and can marry into the congregation. So therefore, we see that Rabbi Yochanan holds that we go based on him, based on the Mitzri, not based on the Mitzris. And if he's a second generation, even though the woman was a first generation, the child will be a third generation. Moshe Rav Yosef Asakash Reb Tarfon Omer says Reb Tarfon Yichol Mamzerin Li Toher. A mamzer can purify himself, right? A mamzer is a mamzer for all generations. However, he can do something about it. Ketzah, what does he do? Mamzer nosa shifcha. Well, if you have a mamzer who marries a Canaanite maidservant, havlad evet, well then the child will be considered a slave, right? The child, as we learned the other day from the pasuk of, it says Isha viladea tirei ladonea. We compare the children to the Shifcha Kanainis to say that they are considered slaves. So Shichachon Nimtza Ben Chor. But if you then free that child, well then he is a free person and he's not a mamzer. So that is how you undo the mamzer situation, by marrying that if the mamzer marries a Canaanite maidservant, the child will be a slave, and then if the child is freed, so then he won't be a mamzer. So we see that it goes based on her, not based on him, right? We're saying that a mamzer could just marry a shifcha kanainis, and then that child will be a slave, and then can be freed, and then will no longer be a mamzer. So we see it's based on her, not based on him. Whereas Rabbi Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that, if you have a second degree mitzvah who marries a first degree mitzvah, then the child is considered a third degree. I will go based on him. So shiny awesome, to which the Gemara says, yeah, but it's different when it comes to a slave. Because the pasuk says, "Aisha viladea tir ladonea," that the woman and her children will be to her master. I.e., we compare the woman to the children. So in that case, it goes based on her. But in general, such as by the Mitzri, it would go based on him. And in our case, where we have a second generation Mitzri, so even with the first generation Mitzris, the child will be considered a third generation Mitzri. Mosiv Rav as the Kasha. Amr Yehuda min Yamin, says Yehuda, min Yamin ger mitzvah lichavim mitamidei Rabbi Akiva. That says Yehuda that he had a colleague named min Yamin ger Mitzri, who was a fellow colleague, a student by Rabbi Akiva of Amar, and Minyamin Ger Mitzri said, Ani Mitzri Rishon, I am a first generation Egyptian, V'nasasi Mitzris Rishona, and I married a first generation Mitzris. Asi Livni Mitzris Shnia, I will marry off my son to a second generation Mitzris, Kadeshi Yehei Ben Bni Roi Lavan B'kol, so that my grandson will then be able to marry into the congregation. And if it enters your mind to say that we go based on him, Afilu Rishona Nami, well then I would think even a first generation new. So what's the kasha? So the kasha is that if it's correct, what Rabbi Baruch Hanan is saying in the name of Yochanan, that by Mitzri we go based on him, not based on her. So if you have a second generation Mitzri sleeping with a first, right, who has a child with a first generation Mitzris, then the child will be based on him. So the child will be a Shlishi. But if that is the case, then how come Minyamin Geramoni, Minyamin Ger Mitzri, how come he said that he himself is a first generation Egyptian convert, and he'll marry his son who's a second generation, Davka to a second generation? The son could theoretically, according to Rabbi Yochanan, even marry a first generation Egyptian convert, since it'll go based on him anyways. So, Ha'amalei Rabbi Yochanan Natana Tni Rishon. Well, the truth is that Rabbi Yochanan actually said that. He said, say that the child who's a Shnia, that Minyamin Ger Mitzri's child who's a Mitzri Sheni, a second generation, would even be able to marry a first generation Mitzris, and the child will be a third generation, and then would be able to marry into the congregation. The Gemara now is going to give another view of what Rabbi Yochanan said, i.e., the Gemara is going to give an alternative view that Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is that the Afka goes by the mitzvahs, it goes based on the mother, not based on the father. Also, Rav Dimi, Rav Yochanan, Rav Dimi came, he said the name of Rav Yochanan, Mitzri, Sheni, Shenot, Mitzri, Shona. If you have a second generation Mitzri who marries a first generation Mitzri, B'no Sheni, the child is considered a second degree, Alma, Basar, Ime, Shadinan Lei, right? So, therefore, we see that it goes based on the mother, not based on the father. As we're saying, that if a second generation Mitzri marries a first generation Mitzri, the child is a Sheni, i.e., the next generation from the mother. Amalei Abaye says to Rav Dimi, Elohad Amar Rabbi Yochanan, but 1 second. Rabbi Yochanan says, if Rishchatos Me'uberes V'yolda, if a fellow sets aside an animal to be a korban chatas, and the animal is pregnant, and the animal gives birth, Rotzim Eskaper Ba, Rotzim Eskaper Bivlada, and says Rabbi Yochanan, well, in that case, if you set aside an animal for a korban chatas, and the animal was pregnant and then gives birth, you could choose, do you want to offer the mother, do you want to offer the offspring, the child? So so this makes sense if you say that the fetus is not considered part of the mother. If the fetus is considered separate from the mother, well, now I understand why you can choose whichever animal you want to offer as your korban chatas. It's as if he's setting aside 2 korban chatases, right, just in case something happens to one of them. And says of Oshai that if you set aside 2 animals to be a korban chatas, so that in case something happens to one of them, you can use the other one. So then miskab b'achas mein, so then you can use one of them for your korban chatas, v'ashniya tireh. And the second one then just grazes until it gets a mum, and then you can sell it and use the money for korbanos. So now, so this makes sense if you say that we consider the fetus to be separate from the mother, i.e., it does not go based on the mother. But if you say that the fetus is considered part of the mother, and similar to in our case where we're saying that the lineage of this Mitzri goes based on the mother, not based on the father. But Havale Vlad Chatas. But if that's the case, that we say that the fetus of the mother is considered like the mother with regard to korbanis, well, if that's the case, Vlad Chatas, well then the child that is born is considered, right, Vlad Chatas, it's considered the child of a Chatas, Vlad Chatas, Lemisa Ozla. And the child of a korban chatas, if you have a korban chatas that gives birth, you have to kill it. You have to kill the child. So therefore, says Abaye, look, I understand what Rabbi Yochanan is saying, that if you have a pregnant korban chatas and then it gives birth, you can choose whichever one you want to offer. That makes sense if you say that the fetus is not considered part of the mother, and therefore they're considered 2 separate animals, and therefore you can choose whichever one that you want. So we see that only makes sense if you say that the fetus is not part of the mother, i.e., we don't go based on the mother. Now, if we don't go based on the mother, well then how could Rabbi Yochanan be saying that if you have a second generation mitzvah who marries a first generation mitzvah, so then it goes based on the mother? Well, what about by Kodshim, where clearly it does not go based on the mother, from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan is saying that he could choose whichever one he wants to offer? So Ishtik Servdimi was quiet. Omrle Dilmashaini Awesome Tichsiv Asher Yivaldu Hakosov Slo Beleda, to which Abaye says, well, maybe you can explain that the reason why, meaning really you can explain that according to Rabbi Yochanan in general, we would say Uber Lav Yerachimo, that the fetus is not considered like the mother, and therefore that's why you could choose whichever one you want to bring as a korban. However, in the context of a Mitzri or an Edomi, so the pasuk Dafka says Banam Asher Yuvaldu, that it's based on the children that will be born, i.e. based on the mother. So in that case we say, if you have a second generation Egyptian marrying a first generation Mitzris, so that a second generation Mitzri marrying a first generation Mitzris, so then in that case Rabbi Yochanan would say, according to this version of Rav Dimi, that we would go based on the mother, and the child would be a second generation Edomi, because we go based on the mother. However, when it comes to Korbanos and other places, so then we would not go based on the mother, we would not say Uber Yerachimo. Fine. Omerle kakafna chazisa l'reishach bene amudei kem Rabbi Yochanan la'ashmaita. To which Rav Dimi says, Abaye, you are a genius. That's exactly it. I knew I saw you in the Beis HaMedrash when Rabbi Yochanan was saying this, which is obviously untrue, because Abaye was in Bavel and Rabbi Yochanan was in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Dimi would travel back and forth and share Rabbi Yochanan's teachings. But what Rav Dimi was saying is, Abaye, you're spot on. It's as if you were there in the Beis HaMedrash when Rabbi Yochanan was teaching it, which is that yes, Davka, because by a Mitzri and a Edomi, Davka says Asher Yuvaldu, that therefore it's based on the mother, even though in general we would not consider it to be based on the mother. So now, Frag the Gemara. Okay, so we're saying that the reason why Rabbi Yochanan is saying that by a Mitzri or an Edomi we go based on the mother is specifically because the pasuk says that it says that that the Egyptians who will be born, the Egyptian converts who will be born, so we go based on the mother. We're talking about birth. But in general, outside of the context of Mitzris and Edomis, we would go based on the father. But one second, I have a kasha. Rava says, if you have a Gentile woman who converts to Judaism, if she's pregnant, right? So she's a pregnant Gentile who's converting to Judaism, so her child does not need separate mikvahing. So am I? But why? Why does the child not need extra mikvah? Right? Meaning, if we're saying that only by an Edomi and a Mitzri we go based on the mother, but otherwise we go based on the father. Well, if that's the case, then how come the mother is going to the mikvah to become a convert works for the child? The child would be based on the father, not based on the mother. So maybe we're going to say like Rabbi Yitzchak, Dam Rabbi Yitzchak, Tvartor Rubo Makbid Olav Chodzetz, Rubo She'eno Makbid Olav Eno Chodzetz. Well, maybe you're going to say, look, really it does go based on the father, but the reason why the mikvah of the mother works for the child is because the only reason why it wouldn't work is because it's a chatzitza, there's a separation, right? The child's inside the mother, there's separation of the mother, right? Separating between the fetus and, right, the unborn child and the mikvah. So therefore, I might think that, meaning the reason why it wouldn't work is because of a chatzitza, but right, the Amr Yitzchak says Rabbi Yitzchak Dvar Torah Ravu Makbid Olav Chotzitz, Rubu V'Sheinu Makbid Olav Eino Chotzitz. Look, something's only considered a separation if it's something that you don't want there. But in this case, the child, wants sort of the mother's protection, so therefore it wouldn't be considered a chatzitza. Something, right, the separation of the fetus and the mother serving as a separation between the fetus and the mikveh is something that is desirable for the fetus. But says of Kana, look, when we say that if you're makbid, it's a problem. If you're not makbid, if you don't care, then it's okay. That's only if it's a majority. But over here, right, over here, the child is entirely inside of the mother, and therefore, that's a complete separation, and therefore, even if the child wants the separation of the mother, still it's going to be a problem. So, and for the Gemara, yeah, but shiny uber danu revise. But look, even at the end of the day, even if it is a complete chatzitza, still, it's sort of just the way that the child grows and therefore and develops, and therefore it's considered okay. So even though, yes, in general, we would go after the father over here, the mikvah of the mother works for the child, since that's just kind of, right, it's not considered chatzitza, it's just kind of how the child develops. Fine. When Ravina came, Amar Rabbi Yochanan said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Be'umis halech achar hazocher, that when it comes to the 7 nations, right, when Joshua came to Eretz Yisrael, so there were 7 nations in Eretz Yisrael, and there was halacha l'schaya kol neshama, that you can't let anybody stay alive. So now that only applies to the the 7 nations that were in Egypt, that were in Canaan. But any other Gentile nations, you don't have to kill everybody. So therefore, it says, when Ravina came, right, Amar Yochanan said the name of Yochanan, Be'umis, when determining who's considered part of the 7 nations that you have to kill and who's not considered the 7 nations and you can leave alive, Halech achar hazocher, you go based on the male. Nisgairu halech achar pogum, if they converts, and you go based on the one who's pagum, the one who's problematic. So we're going to explain what this means. Where am I? Pagum shabishneim. Fine. Bu'umis halech achar hazocher. We said that when it comes to the 7 nations, we go based on the male. Kedetana is learning in the Brayso. Minayin le'echol mina umis shabala knainis. How do you know that if somebody from a different nation that is not one of the 7 nations of Canaan slept with a Canaanite, so veholid ben, and they have a child, shatarasha leknosu be'eved, you can buy that child as a slave, right? I.e., we go based on the male who is not one of the 7 nations, and even though he slept with this woman who is from the 7 nations, who we have to kill and everything, so, but that child goes based on the male, and therefore the father of this child is not one of the 7 nations, and therefore you could buy him as a slave, you don't have to kill him. Shneimar, as the Apostle says, that even from the children of the people who come to live in Eretz Yisrael, even though they're not from Eretz Yisrael, meim tiknu, you can purchase them as slaves. Is it possible that even if you have one of the people from the 7 nations of Canaan who slept with somebody from a different nation, Beholid and Ben, and they had a child, Shatarash Leknosu Be'eved, is it possible that in that case, when the father was from the 7 nations in Canaan, and the mother was from a different nation, is it possible that you can keep him alive and sell him as and purchase him as a slave? Tamulomar, Pasuk says, Asher Olidu Ba'artzachem, it says that Davka, those who were born in your land, right, i.e., born from a male from a different place, not one of the 7 nations, who sleeps with a woman from Eretz Yisrael, so then you can buy that child as a slave. But not if you have somebody from the 7 nations, the male from the 7 nations, who then sleeps with a woman who came to Eretz Yisrael from a different place. In that case, we would also go based on the father, and the father is from the 7 nations, and you would not be allowed to purchase that child as a slave, and you would have to kill the child, since the father is from the 7 nations of Canaan. So then the statement from Rabbi Yochanan had continued that ba'artzachem v'lo min hagarim ba'artzachem, from your land and not from those who live in your land, who have come to your land, is gairu halich achar pogum Wait, what? No, I just said that. I'm sorry. That if they converted, so then you go based on the one that is more problematic. What does it mean? B'mai, what are we talking about? If we're talking about a Mitzri who married an Ammonis, my pogum should be shneim. What does it mean? The one that's more problematic than the other. The Ammonis isn't problematic whatsoever. She's allowed to immediately marry into the congregation. So Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, because after all the pasuk says an Ammoni, a male Ammoni and not an Ammonis, she's allowed immediately to marry to the congregation. Elo b'Ammoni shenotz mitzvahs. Oh, so rather it's talking about an Ammoni where the men are not allowed to marry into the congregation forever, but the women are immediately allowed to marry into the congregation. Shenosa mitzvahs, who marries a mitzvahs that both men and women need to wait 3 generations. Izachar ave shadi basar Ammoni. So if the child is a male, so then it goes based on the father who is an Ammoni, and the child is unable to marry into the congregation at all. Yinekeva have, and if the child is a girl, shadi basar mitzvahs, so then go based on the mother, and she is a mitzvahs, because if it was an Ammoni, right, the female Ammonis can marry into the congregation immediately, so therefore in that case we would go based on the mother, that she's a mitzvahs, and she would have to wait 3 generations. So we go based on whichever one is more stringent. Friends, we're going to hold it here, and that was Daf Ayin Ches of Masechta Yevamos. We're going to have to pick up from here tomorrow. I guess we got our work cut out for us. Peace out.